Hello everybody, I'm your host Tudor, and today I will be guiding you through this tutorial on building a dApp from scratch using sdk-dApp. For a brief overview on what you need to know, you need to have some basic knowledge on React, and you need to have some basic knowledge on the MultiversX blockchain and how it works. What you will learn at the end of this tutorial, you will learn boilerplating your React app, signing, sending, tracking transactions, but also interacting with the smart contract. And you will learn how to use different components and hooks exposed by the package. We'll be building a very simple app. It will only have two pages, a home page and a dashboard. Actually, there will also be an unlock page, but that will be, you'll see a sub page of the home page, so you can see the home page in the background. Next, let's look at how the user flow of our dApp looks like. So you can see here a map of the user flow. The user enters the URL, and if he is logged in, he is directly redirected to the dashboard. In case he is not logged in, he sees the home page, then he clicks the connect button, an unlock panel opens. If the connection is successful, he is redirected to the dashboard, and if not, he remains on the home page. So once he is redirected to the dashboard, he can opt to log out, or he can see there three widgets, which is the first one being the account widget, where he can see the balance and the user address, and eventually the shard, other account information. Then there is a transaction widget, which shows the transactions that he had with the smart contract. And there is a ping pong widget, which allows the user to interact with the ping pong contract that we'll be using, namely sending a ping transaction and sending a pong transaction. With the ping transaction, he is sending some money to the contract. With the pong transaction, he's receiving the same amount back. Then the transaction is processed, and if it's successful, there are some UI state updates, and the transaction is displayed in the transactions table. Next up, let's check what component structure we would need to build such an app. Mainly, we will have three pages. We will have a dashboard, a home page, the unlock page. The app is not a page, but it's the main structure that holds the layout, which actually integrates these three pages: dashboard, home, and unlock. But so I put it here for simplicity. In the dashboard, there will be these three widgets, out of which the ping pong Abbey widget will be the most complex one. It will use some hooks to interact with the contract or to display some information. For example, it needs to get the ping to query the contract to see what is the ping amount that it needs to send to the contract, then to send the transactions, and to get the seconds remaining before sending the ping transaction. Also, we'll have some shared components: a button, a label, an output container to use to output different information, a link, a component to format EGLD amounts, and a transaction table, which will basically come from sdk-dApp. Okay, now that we know what we have to build, I have split the development process into different chapters. Even though the app is pretty small, the development process will take some time, so it's easier to understand if it's split in parts. So I've split it in 6 parts, and each part has its own steps. For example, we will start with creating the boilerplate for the new React app. Then we'll prepare the basic app structure with routing. We will install sdk-dApp. We'll create the dashboard and the widgets, make some final adjustments to the header, footer, and layout, and then interact with the smart contract. So without further ado, let's jump right into developing our project. I have here a tutorials folder which contains some sh files, some scripts that I will be sometimes using across the development. I won't be using them extensively, but if you want to follow the development process and you don't want to build everything yourself, you can choose your own step until which you want the project to be finished, and then you just run the scripts until that point, and you can continue by hand afterwards. Let's now start our dApp boilerplate by opening the terminal and using npx with the argument create Vite latest ping pong tutorial with a template of React TypeScript. Okay, the application structure is created. We now want to inspect the package.json file to see if it looks good, and it seems it looks all right. So all we have to do is open again the terminal and run yarn to install the dependencies. Next up is configuring TailwindCSS. So we want to add TailwindCSS first. Then we want to add some dependencies for TailwindCSS, which is TailwindCSS Vite, PostCSS, CLI, and autoprefixer. Okay, they're done. We want now to create a TailwindCSS file with importing TailwindCSS and then pasting an image here that we'll use for our background. And in the main TSX file, we want to import this file. And now we want to create the PostCSS configuration. I'll just paste it here. Okay. And the configuration is completed. And we need to replace the default index.css file and paste the new contents. Next up is copying the MultiversX logo SVG into the public folder. So we will copy it from its original location to the public folder. Okay, it's now copied, and now let's install ESLint and Prettier. All right, and create a Prettier configuration. Just paste it here and do the same for the ESLint configuration. We'll now proceed to configuring Vite. Let's install the necessary dependencies, which are node types, SSL for HTTPS, some polyfills, polyfills for a plugin for loading SVGs, and a plugin for absolute paths. Okay, now the dependencies are installed, and let's paste the Vite configuration from clipboard. Okay, we have it here with the node polyfills, and we will just remove the two created TS configs and keep only one, which we will edit now. Paste the configuration here, like this, with module resolution set to Banter. The final part of this step is configuring linting. We'll replace the existing linting script and run it in the terminal. Say yarn lint and wait for it to finish, and then start the development server to see if our application is running. Okay, we have it here, so our app is running. The UI is not perfect, but we will fix it later. We are now back in our index file to review what we just did. We finished chapter 1 and we bootstrapped the project, we added Tailwind, we configured ESLint and Prettier, we configured Vite, and formatted the project. And we also checked if the project is running. So next we can go forward with the second chapter, which will be installing React Router, creating the homepage, creating the routes, the layout, and updating the main app TSX. Okay, so let's go ahead and install the React Router DOM. We need to open the terminal and say yarn add React Router DOM and wait for it to install. Okay, it's finished. And then we will create a new pages folder. Let's say new folder under src pages. And here we want to create a new home page. Say new file, home. Okay, and just paste the contents here from the clipboard. Okay, this is our home page. And we'll create also an index file to export the home page. Export all from home. All right. And now we want to create a routes folder. So let's say new folder, src routes. Okay, let's now go ahead and create the main routes configuration file. It will be under src routes. Okay, and just paste the configuration here. And what you see, what we did here is we imported the home page. We created routes enum that we can reference across the project, so we don't get any typos when we refer to routes. We have a route type with children and a basic routes configuration. And here we will add the unlock page later. I will explain why we created it like this. Okay, and now we can go further and create a new file. We'll say index.ts, and here we will export everything from routes. All right, that's done. And we want now to create a components folder. We'll say new folder, src components, and we want to go ahead and add a new layout. First, we need to create a folder and then add the layout component. Here it is, and paste the layout component from clipboard. All right. And now, of course, here we need also an index file, and we need to export the layout component from the index file. That's done. And we need an index for the components folder, where we will reference this layout component that we just created. Next up is updating the main app tsx file. We'll navigate to it, select everything, and paste the app content. And you see here what we did is we have a new function with the router, we have the layout that we just created, we have the routes, and we have the routes structured in such a way that it can display child routes. Okay, that's done. And what we still have to do is run linting again to make sure everything was linted correctly. Say yarn lint. Okay, and now everything is linted. Let's review a bit what we just did. Um, we installed React Router DOM. We created the pages folder and the home page, added routes, created the layout component, and updated the app.tsx file with routing configuration. Next, we want to install the MultiversX SDK packages and some dependencies. All right, so this will be our MultiversX main setup. Let's open the terminal and say yarn add MultiversX sdk-dApp, MultiversX sdk-dApp utils, which is a dependency, the sdk-dApp UI, which we'll need for the UI. We'll also use SDK core, big number, Axios for some async calls, moment for handling time-related processing, and protobuf.js, which is necessary for SDK core. So we will just wait for it to install. It will take some time. Okay, and the setup is completed. With this, we have reached chapter 4. This will be a bit longer. We will create some configs for the dApp because we need our dApp to be configurable depending on the environment. We'll use DevNet for this tutorial. We'll create a dashboard folder structure. We will install some dependencies, font awesome and class names. We will create some helper components that we will use across our pages and widgets. Then create the account widget, the ping pong widget, and the main widget, which will render these ones. They will only have placeholders for now, but we will hook them up later to sdk-dApp. Then we will create the dashboard component and update the routes to handle the dashboard. Okay, so now we want to add the configs for our dApp. We'll create a new folder. It's called config. And here we will create a new file called config.devnet. Here it is. And first import environments enum from sdk-dApp. And then with this, we will be able to reference the devnet environment. We'll paste the rest here. We have the contract address, the environment, which is devnet. We want a new index file, which will export everything from this config that we just created. And then we are moving to package.json to create here different start scripts depending on the environment we are on. That's why we also have a copy script that will be run every time we start our dApp on the devnet environment. All right. Let's also lint the project, make sure linting is applied. Next is creating the dashboard folder structure. Say new folder, pages dashboard. And here we will have a folder called components with a new component, a widget component. This component will be used to render our different widgets. It now has an error because it doesn't have font awesome. That's why we need to install it next. Okay, so let's now open the terminal to install font awesome and class names. Say yarn add class names and yarn add font awesome. We will use the free font awesome and React font awesome and wait for it to install. Okay, this is installed, and now we want to create some helper components, and we'll start with the label. We'll paste the configuration here, the content here, and an output container like this, output container, and again paste here the structure. Also we want a button like this, and we want an index file here to export these newly created components. So export everything from label, export everything from output container, and export everything from button. Okay, that's done. We'll now go ahead with creating some dashboard widgets. The first two of them, which will be the account widget and the ping pong widget. We'll say new file under src pages dashboard widgets, the account widget. So here we have only placeholders for the address, the shard, and the balance, and we will fill these in later once we connect to the information from the sdk-dApp. Let's also create the ping pong widget and paste its content. It only has two buttons and an output container, and we also want an index file for this to export them from here. Let's paste the text here. Okay. What we still have to do now is create the dashboard page. We'll say new file, dashboard. Okay, and paste the dashboard content, which references these newly created two widgets and renders them. We also want an index file that we'll use to export the dashboard page. And then we also want to update the main index file from pages with this newly created dashboard page. And the last thing that we want to do is go to the routes and add the dashboard components, the newly dashboard page created, and also add it to the routes enum like this, and paste here the route. And the last thing is to lint the project again to make sure everything looks good. Say yarn lint. Okay. Let's shortly review what we just did. We just finished the fourth chapter by creating the dashboard and some of the widgets. And next we want to create the header, footer, and layout components. And once we finish this, we also create the unlock page component. And when everything is finished, we can proceed with interacting with sdk-dApp. So next in line is creating some generic UI components. First is a link component. We'll go to components and say mx link. Okay, like this. It's just a link. We will also export it here. Okay, so the component is created, and we want to create an unlock page like this and just paste its content here. We will link this page to sdk-dApp in the next chapter. So we want to export it and update the routes. We'll use it here, say unlock, and then add it to the enum and paste its structure here. Okay, so our app will also have a header and a footer. So we want to add these components to the layout. So we'll create first a header, which will have an unlock or a connect and a close button like this. They will be also hooked to sdk-dApp. And we'll have a footer where we will paste the GitHub repo. We'll link the GitHub repo. Okay, header and footer index. And we want to update the main layout to use our newly created header and footer components. Put the header here and put the footer here. So the layout is updated. Now that we are done with creating the header and the footer, the last missing widget that we need is the transactions widget. We'll create it under dashboard widgets and also first initialize it with placeholders. We also want to export it from the widgets index, and we want to update the dashboard page to also use this transaction widget. Let's put it here. Okay, and add an entry to the widgets array. Okay, so lastly, again, lint the project, open the terminal and run lint. Okay. Just like before, let's quickly review what we just did. We just finished chapter 5, meaning that we have now a header, a footer, we have the updated layout component, and everything is ready to be hooked to sdk-dApp. So if we scroll underneath and we look at our application structure, we know we have the pages, we have the layout, we have the widgets, and we have most of the components. There are maybe 2 missing components, and these hooks will be created when we reach the last step of hooking up the ping pong Abby widget. But before we proceed with the last chapter, let's also check if our app is still working. So we'll say run task start devnet. The devnet config is being copied, and we want to open our app and see if it works. We have it here, so we only have 2 pages. So connect leads to dashboard, going back leads to home, and these are our 2 pages, and they're waiting for the information to be connected to the store of sdk-dApp. We'll now start interacting with sdk-dApp. We need to update our main tsx file. We will replace the existing content because we need to wrap the create root or the bootstrapping of our application with the init app function, which sets very important settings for the sdk-dApp, which would be, for example, the way it persists information or on which environment it's configured, which theme it should use, and other important settings. But these are the basic ones that we will use for now. The next thing that we want to do is configuring logging into our application. That's why we need to go to the unlock page and import the unlock panel manager, and also import use isGetLoggedIn hook. So now we replace the placeholder to have the real information about the user being logged in, and we make a reference to the unlock panel manager, and we also configure it with the necessary handlers. What happens on login and what happens on close. On login we go to the dashboard, on close we go to back to home. And then when the user enters the page, we simply show the unlock panel manager. Okay, so this is our unlock page refactored. Now we need to go to the header and we need to handle the login state. Again, we use is get logged in hook. We replace is logged in, and here we also get a reference to the account provider because we will need it when we need to log out. So we'll say handle logout await provider.logout, and here on connect we go to unlock. Next would be displaying user information in the account widget. First, we need to create a new file, which will be format amount. Format amount will use controller and a component from sdk-dApp UI, which will format EGLD balances. We also want to export this component from index.ts file. Let's put the export here. And now we want to go directly to the account widget and add some sdk-dApp imports because we need to have a way to inspect the account. We'll use the useGetAccount hook, and this gives us the address, the balance, and the shard which we want to display. And we will replace the placeholders with this new information. Okay, so now the account widget is updated successfully. For the transactions widget, we will use a similar approach. We need first to create a transactions table, which will also have a controller from sdk-dApp and a UI component from sdk-dApp UI. So we made here the necessary imports, and now we'll build it with several pieces. First one being a process transactions function. Then we need a reference to the address and one to the network. And we'll create a use effect that when transactions are received, they are also processed and injected into the table. Now we have exported it, and just like with the account widget, we will use it inside our transactions component. We also put here some imports from sdk-dApp. We create a state to store transactions. We get our information from the hooks, and when a new transaction is received and success state is changed, we want to fetch the transactions. And now we'll edit this fetch transactions function. We'll say data get transactions. We'll query the API for transactions to the contract, and we pass these new transactions to the transactions table. Last but not least is creating our ping pong widget. We first have to create a new folder called contracts, and in this folder we'll create a new file which will be our ping pong JSON, and let's paste the contracts here, the contract contents. And if we look inside the contract, we see that it has some functions that we can call, some endpoints. For example, the ping endpoint, the pong endpoint, and get pong enabled timestamp, get time to pong. We'll only use these three for now, which is get time to pong, ping, and pong, and also the ping amount. And for this, we need to create some hooks that will query the contract, and we need some helpers for these hooks. So inside the widgets folder, we'll create a hooks folder, and inside this hooks folder, we'll first create use get sc controller hook. Now this hook gets the network from sdk-dApp, and then the reference is the ABI, and creates an SC controller that we will later use. We will create a similar hook called use get smart controller factory. It works similarly. Okay, so it's created now, and now we want to call the function use get ping amount. For this, we'll create a hook called use get ping amount, and this hook uses um, the SC controller that we just created to query the contract. Next up is creating use get time to pong hook. We'll paste the contents here. It uses the SC controller to query the contract with the get time to pong function. And next we want hook that will help us display the seconds remaining. So once we get the time to pong, we have here a function called get seconds remaining, and we'll store the variables in state, and we have a variable that will help us see how many seconds there still are until we can query, and also a variable that displays a countdown. And both of these variables will be exported at the end. Next, we will again use an interaction with sdk-dApp by creating the use send pick transaction hook. This hook gets the user address, gets a reference to the smart contract factory. It creates the transaction using the smart contract factory, then gets an instance to the transaction manager, and firstly, it needs to sign the transaction with the connected provider. Once the transaction is signed, it uses the transaction manager to send the transaction. And then it uses the same transaction manager to track the transaction, and here it passes some information that will be displayed inside the toast that appears once the transaction is sent and or successfully resolved. Similarly, we'll create the use send pong transaction. We'll paste the contents, which will be similar to the other hook. And next, we need to create an index file and to export the hooks that we will be using inside our ping pong ABI widget. Now it's time to edit our ping pong ABI widget and to use the hooks that we just created. So we need to import them first. Then we need to use them inside the body of our component. And we need to hook up the existing buttons, which did nothing until now. So we add the on-click handler for each button. And next we need to add some states for disabled state. So for that, we need to check if some transactions are in progress. So while transactions are in progress, we don't want to be able to click the buttons. That's why we always check for whether ping is enabled or transactions are in progress. Then lastly, we need to edit the output container. And here we want to display the contract address, and we want to display the time remaining until the user is able to pong. That's why we need to use moment to format our countdown seconds that we get from our hook. Okay, so this is the time remaining, and we can check again the component structure. We see here that if we have countdown seconds more than 0, we can display the time remaining. Before we start interacting with our dApp, we want to have guarded routes. That's why we want to create a new file which will be called auth redirect wrapper, which will guard our home and unlock and dashboard route. We also want to export it, and we want to use it inside our layout, and we will wrap the children that are displayed here in our newly created component. So that's done. We can check the component again. We see here that it looks whether the user is logged in. If the user is logged in, then the user is redirected to the dashboard. If he is not logged in, he is redirected to home. Now it's time to check if our application is actually working. That's why I will say run task start devnet. Then we'll start the browser like this, open, and bring it here. And we will use the web wallet to connect. I already have a key store created, so I'll access it like this. Access wallet, and we are here, but we have no funds. That's why we need to get some funds. So we'll go to the devnet wallet and use the faucet there. Log in again with the same key store. And choose faucet. I'm not a robot. Request tokens. All right. And the token should arrive soon. We can return here and wait a bit for the tokens to arrive. And here we have 5x EGLD. Next is creating our first ping transaction. We'll say ping, go to the devnet wallet, enter the password. We have here data ping, sign and submit, and wait for the transactions to be processed. All right, the transaction has been successfully executed. We see now that our status here has updated, and we need to wait for 2 minutes to be able to send the Pong transaction. The time is almost up. We still have to wait for 19 seconds until we are able to Pong. And we need to check if the Pong button is automatically getting enabled once the timer reaches 0. Let's see. All right, it has been enabled. We can Pong. Again, go to the web wallet, enter the password, access, and sign and submit. We can also press view all here, and we'll see a notifications feed with the transaction being processed and the first ping transaction. We also see here the first transaction that has been successful, and wait for the second transaction to execute. All right. Again, ping is again enabled, which is correct. And if we reload the page, we have both of the transactions in the transactions list. Let's now make a quick overview of how our DApp is working, what we implemented until now. So we know that we have an app TSX, which is implementing a router, and under the router we have this main component, which is the layout, and then in the layout we have the header with 2 buttons, connect and close. And when we connect, we go to the unlock page. The unlock page is a child route of the home page. So if we navigate to it, we see that once we arrive on the unlock page, if we are not logged in, then the unlock panel gets opened. When the user clicks a provider and logs in, he is automatically redirected to the dashboard via the navigate function. So then in the dashboard, we have the three widgets, the account, the ping pong API, and the transactions widget, out of which we will explain the ping pong API now. And here you can see that we have the two buttons and we have an output container. Here we see the contract. Here we have the actions that we just did, sending the ping transactions and the pong transaction, which are disabled when we have pending transactions. And when the seconds remaining is null, meaning that there is no information, it means that user can ping. Whenever we have seconds remaining, we see the countdown. And whenever the countdown ends, we can pong the contract. So this is the main structure. Thanks for having the patience to follow me until this point, and happy coding.